Hi, everybody. Welcome to Act Now. I am very happy to have my guest coming. I announced this last Tuesday, and I'm very happy that the day is finally here. We're going to be talking about America's class war with Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Chris Hedges. Chris, thanks for joining me on the program today.
Sure. Anytime, Julianna.
Well, let's just start with your piece from Common Dreams. You talk about America's class war and how organized labor is one of the best tools to push back against the rich. Your quote is that, well, first of all, where are we in the class war? People seem to be generally engaged in the culture war. In your estimation, are people aware that we're on a grand scale, that we actually are in a class war?
I think younger workers are, because, of course, they're suffering disproportionately. So you've seen labor activity at Starbucks, Amazon, Lyft, Uber, John Deere, Kellogg, the special metals plant owned by Warren Buffett, Berkshire Hathaway, Kroger, which just settled with a $5 an hour increase, I believe, and then all the teacher strikes in West Virginia and Chicago, Oakland, Arizona, fast food workers, hundreds of nurses in Worcester, Massachusetts, the members of the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees. So there is a lot of labor ferment, which I think is extremely hopeful, because that is the only mechanism left by which workers are going to defend themselves from this fleecing by corporate power and the oligarchic elite, which are amassing staggering sums of money. I mean, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are each worth about $200 billion. We have to put that in proportion. I think when John D. Rockefeller died, he was worth about $3 billion. I mean, even the big kleptocrats like Imelda Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, I think they stole like 10 billion or something. I mean, so this kind of social inequality is something that we've not seen in American history, even going back to the days of the robber barons. And if you look at the late 19th century, early 20th century, you spawned militant labor movements against this social inequality. Yes, these were manufacturing-based jobs, so it's a little different. We're down to now 9-10% of the U.S. labor force is unionized. We've entered, the so-called gig economy, where everybody becomes a temp worker, whether they want to be or not, so that as soon as the company decides they don't need a certain number of employees, they're just instantly laid off without benefits or job protection. And history has shown that the only effective way for working men and women to protect their interests is to organize and use the weapon of the strike. Individually, we're virtually powerless against the ruling elites, but collectively, we do have power. And I think the most important component of that is aligning ourselves with a political party that stands fast with working men and women. The Democratic Party, if you go back before Clinton, had a relationship with labor and would at least take labor into account. That's all gone. The two-party duopoly each has made war on the working class. It was the Clinton administration that pushed through some of the most draconian measures. NAFTA was probably the greatest betrayal of the working class since the Taft-Hartley Act, which makes it very hard to organize, which was passed in 1947 or 48, was Clinton, who deregulated the FCC and allowed the media systems to become consolidated in the hands of about a half dozen corporations. And it was Clinton that made war on welfare. And people forget that under our welfare system, before it was dismantled by the Clinton administration, 70% of the recipients were children. Yes, I think that there is certainly among people in their 20s and understanding that what they have been offered is really a kind of dead end. And I think that's also why, we have 3% of the workforce, 4 million people have walked out on their jobs. And most of those jobs, this is why they have shortages in healthcare, food services, transportation, housing, utilities. These are all frontline workers, and it's because they're so poorly paid, and especially with a pandemic, their work is so risky. I don't like to base opinions on polls, but in a recent Gallup poll, 68% of Americans said they supported unions, and between the ages of 18 and 34, that figure rose to 77%. So
that's hopeful.
Yeah, I think that certainly among this generation, I mean, what did I read? Millennials have like 2% of wealth. I mean, it's just criminal.
And they're educated mostly. It's
yeah,
a lot of the people,
and they're all in debt. They're all suffering from student debt.
How long do you think it might take us to get back to pre-Reagan numbers for, percentages of people who are in labor unions?
Well, that depends how willing workers are to use the weapon they have, which can cripple the economic power and ultimately political power of the elite, and that's the strike. So if you go back, there was actually a pretty good article in Jacobin a little while ago by
Nick. I think that's what I'm referring to. They had the graphs.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. He was drawing from a book by a sociologist who, until I read the article, I had not heard of, Walter Korpi, who wrote a book called The Democratic Class Struggle. And Korpi looked at how Swedish workers built the most advanced welfare state, eliminating poverty, the most advanced welfare state in Europe. And it was precisely through heavy union membership. I think 76% of Swedish workers were unionized, and then waves of strikes, shutdowns, slowdowns, militant labor activity. But then the key, of course, is that they were allied with the Swedish Democratic Workers' Party, the SAP. You need a party. This is also true in Germany. People forget, because it's a parliamentary system, the Labor Party in Germany doesn't poll huge numbers, 5, 6, 7%, but it makes them a factor in terms of the balance of power. But Sweden's really the example. That's been largely dismantled, unfortunately, in Sweden. But this is the formula that works. And it's the formula that we have to begin to adopt.
Do you think the Working Families Party could play any kind of role here, or are they too beholden to the two-party system as they kind of work within the Democratic Party?
Well, they've made an alliance in New York State with the Democratic Party. There are a series of the Green Party, Socialist Alternative in Seattle. I'm quite good friends with Shama Sawant. This new People's Party, there are these small parties. None of them have really caught fire, but I think that's because people are herded election cycle after election cycle in the name of fear into the embrace of the Democratic Party. Because in the American system, we don't really get to vote for who we want. We just get to vote who we're against. This is true in the Republican Party as it is in the Democratic Party. That's
interesting. In terms of what happened with labor during 2020, how close do you think we got to a general strike? I mean, we had the Transit Workers Alliance striking. We had the airline flight attendants unions. We had some of the other unions all fighting for safe working conditions at the same time. Is there any evidence that joining forces with each other is on the horizon or was on the horizon at that time?
No, those were over specific demands within the corporate structures that these workers worked under or within. General strikes generally happen at the tail end of a dying regime. They're political weapons. Yes, of course, they cripple the country economically. But they come with a clear attempt to destroy a system of power. So the general strike was quite effective when you look at the Cuban Revolution, that's general strike was a huge factor in bringing down Batista, a huge factor in bringing down the Shah of Iran. So general strikes are what happens at the end of labor consciousness. Right now, we're at the beginning, where we're seeing workers begin to understand that the only vehicle they have left by which they can receive wages that make possible a sustainable lifestyle and doesn't put them in a situation where they're food insecure or they can't pay their rent or their medical bills or anything else, is the strike, and that requires unionization. But a general strike generally is, there may be an example of general strikes that are not aimed at politically destroying a power elite, but I can't think of one.
Mm-hmm. As we move on in our discussion of class warfare, there are so many different intersections in terms of society and how it foments the class war. Can we talk? You are a former, or I guess a current Presbyterian minister.
Right.
You work in a prison ministry. Your most recent book, as I said at the top of the show, is Our Class, Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison. I'd like to transition to talking about the intersection of religion and the class war. It certainly seems like there is a role being played here. The negative and fascistic tendencies of many of these religious organizations are quite clear. What do you see the roles of, do you see any of the religions in the United States either fomenting or ameliorating this class warfare issue?
Well, the Christian right, of course, which is bankrolled by the most retrograde forces of American capitalism, the Koch Foundation, Purdue, Tyson Foods, etc., is anti-union. But I wrote a book about a decade ago called The Christian American Fascists, the Christian Right in the War in America. You are correct. I am a seminary graduate. My father was a minister. My mother graduated from seminary, was a professor, and I am ordained. I look at them as heretics. I look at them as using the Christian religion to sacralize the worst aspects of American imperialism and American capitalism. But they have become a very potent force. And a lot of these corporations will actually hire evangelical ministers to work in their warehouses among their workers, because, of course, if the whole notion of piety and faith is about gaining material wealth, and that those who have material wealth have been blessed because God or Jesus wants them blessed, then you don't need unions, you don't need healthcare plans, you don't need anything else. And if you are poor and marginalized within this ideology, it's because you deserve to be. That's the Christian right, which I've made war on for many years. In terms of the liberal church, they've kind of checked out with the rest of liberal society. We go back again to the turn of the century, Rauschenbusch and these figures in the social gospel. These were Christian socialists, huge involvement with unions. They ran the largest. Chautauqua ran one of the largest prison education programs in the country, and then you saw the elites. Again, use their money, the Rockefellers, all these figures, the Carnegies and others, to essentially promote this version of the prosperity gospel, which has now become so distorted and grotesque in the hands of the Christian right, and marginalize those figures within the religious establishment that had a conscience. You did see in the 1960s, my father was a World War II veteran, but very active in the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, and then later in the gay rights movement. So you did see the rise of those, a certain segment of the clergy, the Berrigans, Phil and Dan Berrigan, which were kind of heroes in our household, Dorothy Day, all these figures, of course, King, Malcolm X. We must not forget that Malcolm came rooted in a very strong religious tradition. But they often fought with their own institutions. So the institutions didn't necessarily embrace what they did, number one. And number two, that backlash in the 70s against what Samuel Huntington, the political scientist, called our excess of democracy also took place in the church. So the church replicated the retreat by the liberal class. And I wrote a book called The Death of the Liberal Class that kind of lays this out in about 250 pages. But they also did that retreat. So what did spirituality become? It was kind of how is it with me kind of stuff, which is really narcissism, has nothing to do with spirituality at all, but plays into the kind of cult of the self that has gripped the wider society. So unfortunately, on the one side, we have the Christian fascists who are very negative influence, and are siding with the capitalist corporate class. And then on the other side, we have a kind of feckless, unfocused liberal church, which I think is just a mirror of a feckless, unfocused liberal class.
Oh, I love it when you say that. The feckless, unfocused liberal class. Two thoughts diverge in the woods here, Chris. Which one should I follow? My question, I guess, is going to be about the Poor People's Campaign that you're seeing coming out of the South. Reverend Barber, Reverend Theo Harris, they seem to be some like the best of what the left actually has at this point.
Within the church, yeah, without question. Well, they draw their roots from King and from those traditions, which are real within the church. My father came out of that, but it does, I suppose, exist on the margins of religious institutions. But it's certainly been minimized as a force within the institutional church itself. And we have to remember that, church numbers within the liberal mainstream denominations are declining with such rapidity that the hierarchy of these churches, I'm Presbyterian, is no different, really are just catering to the lowest common denominator in order to stop the bleeding. Mm-hmm. And that means not taking on any controversial issues that could alienate members of the congregation, especially those members of the congregation that have money. But yes, I think Barber is an example of the tradition that I admire and come out of and ascribe to. But that was far more widespread in the 1960s and very widespread at the turn of the century, of the beginning of the 20th century.
It doesn't seem like with our current media configuration that we have that you mentioned in the earlier part of the show, the corporate ownership, the conglomeration, that someone like Reverend Barber, who back when there were only 3 channels, might actually make it onto one of the national networks, that the media establishment doesn't allow someone like a Reverend Barber, Reverend Theo Harris to actually reach the masses.
Yeah, I mean, we have to also remember that the mainstream media outlets were very hostile to King. I mean, they demonized Malcolm, of course, but they were very hostile to King. People should go back after King gave his very courageous speech on April 4th, 1967 at Riverside Church denouncing the war in Vietnam. Go back and read the editorial in the New York Times. It's just a blistering assault against King. So, King has been sanitized, kind of cleaned up, frozen in his "I have a dream" speech, but we forget the fierce attacks that.
But at least he was mentioned. I mean, these people are just not even mentioned.
Yeah, well, It was a little hard not to mention King when he was pulling, hundreds of thousands of people under the Mall of Washington, or 50,000 people, I forget the exact number, in Memphis or anywhere else.
I mean, Reverend Barber and his group almost, along with Stacey Abrams, handed the Senate over to got those 2 folks elected that would have been Republican seats had they not been doing that kind of work, and yet still no coverage and a lot of voter suppression focused directly on their souls to the polls Sunday voting apparatus.
Yeah, I mean, but so much isn't covered because the corruption of news is now just fused with info, entertainment, trivia, celebrity, gossip, especially on the electronic media. They don't really make any pretense anymore of doing news. But yes, you're right. The way they're dealt with is essentially throwing them into a black hole.
Oh, well, I have even found that, people with good intentions take their platforms to the internet, and then in order to sort of play the internet algorithm, they too have to fall into this infotainment. What did Joy Reid say? What did Joy Behar say? Kind of bullshit. And oh yeah, I can swear because we're not and I find it very difficult to find places where you can actually have a straight conversation or some kind of conversation that provides you context with what's going on in the world right now.
Yeah, well, that's by intent, and the algorithms, which I've been hit with, I don't know if you've been hit with, make sure that you remain on the margin. So we carried out, tried to organize
our new segment, marginalized.
We tried to organize a union at TruthDig, in part to protest the attempt by the publisher to fire Bob Scheer, and then she shut the site down. So shows where. But this is true, Advice and all sorts of other places that have tried to unionize on the quote unquote progressive left. When it actually comes to allowing unions for their employees, they don't want any part of it. But that last year that I was there before she shut it down, the IT people ran a graph of my columns, and it's called, I'm not savvy on the internet, but it's called Impressions, where if you went into Google and you typed in imperialism, and I had written something recently on imperialism, it would come up with anything else. Well, those algorithms make sure you don't come up. They've actually essentially erased WikiLeaks and Julian Assange this way. And so that graph showed referrals to my articles from impressions declining from over 700,000 to well below 200,000. And I'm sure they're even further below now. So we saw that quite egregious example of that when Twitter locked the New York Post out of its own Twitter account because it didn't want the dissemination of the information that the New York Post had exposed on Hunter Biden's laptop. So those algorithms, this censorship, I was opposed to removing Donald Trump from social media. I'm thankful never to have to be assaulted on a daily basis with Trump's tweets or statements. On the other hand, we have to acknowledge that these corporations, which know everything about us, we know nothing about them, are not transparent monitors. They should not be given this power of censorship, and because it, as history has shown, it always comes back in the end to essentially
to hurt the left
in times of turmoil.
Yes. Your most recent book, Our Class, Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison. Can you talk about, I've heard you speak about this, and your work at the prison is so moving. And can you talk about whether you said before we got on the air that that a lot of people who are publishing books right now are having a difficult time because the pandemic has really decimated book purchasing. But do you believe that your book itself has been, marginalized in the same way, say your internet writings have been?
Well, usually my books get reviewed by major publications like the New York Times, the Washington Post. They're often trashed. My favorite was, I think it was America. I Can't Pages of Rebellion. Me even made it to the front page of the Sunday book review section. Of course, it was ripped to pieces. This book did not get reviewed at all. I don't know what it was, but all authors are struggling. People will come in for an author talk virtually, but they tend not to buy the books, not in the same kinds of numbers. So I don't know what it was.
Yeah, people can't even really know about it if they're not seeing your
Yeah,
articles, if it's not even you have your own fan base, or, I don't know if you would call it fans, but people who rely on you for information. And even if they see your book trashed in the New York Times, they say, oh, he's got a new book, I'm just going to go get it. I'm not going to listen to the New York Times.
right. That's what Ralph
Um,
Nader said. He'd just be happy they spelled your name right. Um, my favorite was a former professor said, "Don't worry, no book's that bad."
Well, your book, Our Class, Trauma and Transformation, you're seeing the title, you're seeing it here, where you talk about your work in in Rahway, isn't it, in New Jersey, the prison system there, and how you it taught these inmates, you pulled out of them plays and you taught them how to write plays about their own experience. Could you talk a little bit about that experience and why it led you to write it into a book?
Well, it was an amazing experience, and that I was teaching drama, and just on a whim decided that they should, because they had very little familiarity with theater, should write scenes out of their own lives,
Mhm.
so they would get used to writing dramatic dialogue. And what I didn't know is that there was one student in particular, a wonderful guy nicknamed Kabir, which in Arabic means big, and this guy was big. Um, had listened to me on WBAI and recruited the best writers in the prison. I mean, very, very talented writers. And they started turning in these amazing scenes that we then cobbled together in a play that was eventually performed at the theater in Trenton, New Jersey, the Passage Theater. Sold out audiences every night, because, of course, unfortunately, mass incarceration has touched many, many families in Trenton. We had a night for the families of the playwrights. They wept through the entire play. It was later published by Haymarket. But it became a vehicle not only to rip down the emotional walls that people build for themselves to protect themselves in prison, but also just a window into what they have endured, the suffering that has been visited upon them, both before prison, because of poverty and police violence, and a judicial system that railroads the poor into the prison system, and then, of course, the dehumanization of mass incarceration itself. And so I waited several years before writing it, I think in part because I needed several of my students to get out, to kind of follow what happened to them afterwards. And my heart's on every page of that book. It really is an attempt to humanize the victims of our prison system. People I care a lot about and people that I admire. I mean, we're talking about students, not just one or two, but several who graduated summa cum laude from Rutgers. This is a wonderful Rutgers program, NJ STEP, that provides college courses in the prison for which you can then get your degree. So, I mean, imagine graduating summa cum laude from Rutgers in normal times, but imagine doing that from a cell. So incredibly articulate, incredibly thoughtful, in this case, men, although I've also taught in the women's prison in New Jersey. It's so tragic. I mean, what has been done to them, what has been done to their families, and ultimately us. I mean, we are impoverished because these draconian sentences. I mean, I was just up in Orange County, New York. Another tragic story. One of my students, wonderful guy, got out. He and his girlfriend had a son. The son was born premature, had needed oxygen 24 hours a day. He didn't have any money. He started selling drugs. He's picked up and thrown back in prison for 2.5 years for drugs. And I went for his sentencing, drove up to Gosham, New York for his sentencing. In the courtroom, and the prosecuting attorney who had read his conviction, I think he was 26 years in prison, New Jersey, said it was a robbery. He didn't kill anybody. He said if this was New York State, he wouldn't have gotten 3 or 4 years. And then you have a huge number of people in the prison system who just did not commit the crime, but they don't have any resources to hire a lawyer, because 94% of the people in the prison system never get a jury trial. They're coerced into pleading out, and the police and the prosecutors stack all these charges on them. which the prosecutor and police know they didn't commit, but it becomes bartering chips. Okay, kidnapping in New Jersey is 25 years. So they just will stack kidnapping on there. Doesn't matter whether you kidnapped anyone or not. And then they say, okay, we'll take that off. We'll take this off. And the students that I invariably teach with the longest prison sentences are the ones who didn't commit the crime because they went to a jury trial. And they have to be made an example of. So none of the charges are removed. They don't have competent legal representation. It may come as a shock to people, but police lie all the time.
Not anyone in our audience. It's not.
Yeah, and off they go. So, I mean, I had one student, he's 14 years old. His parents are both dead. He's living in an abandoned house in Camden, which per capita is the poorest city in America. He's functionally illiterate. He's 90 pounds. He's 14. He's grabbed for a rape and a killing, a murder, which he didn't commit, dragged into a police station. He has no adult support, nothing. He has 3 detectives browbeating him all night to sign a confession, which he doesn't even understand. And off he goes. And when he gets to the trial and he hears what's in the confession, he attempts to protest. It's not true. It doesn't make any difference. He's sentenced as an adult, and he's not eligible for parole until he's 70 years old.
Did he go to a for-profit prison out of curiosity?
Every prison in America is for profit.
There you go. Yeah, I don't know. Just the way you're describing this, it's certainly reminiscent of the Jim Crow South and the slave.
Of course, it's protean. It's just a continuation. So, yeah,
and no one made mention in that courtroom.
Private prisons are ICE uses them a lot. There are some private prisons, but the functions inside the prison, they're all privatized. So Global Tellink, the phone service, Armark, which provides the food, which, there's constant cases of food poisoning. It's rancid. It's unedible. The commissary is privatized. The medical is privatized. Money transfer, JPay is privatized. It's a multi-billion-dollar a year industry. And these lobbyists are down there writing the laws to make sure that they continue with a 76% recidivism rate within 5 years, because they've got to keep those cages full, because that's how they make their money. These bodies in deindustrialized centers like Newark or Detroit or anywhere else, they're not worth anything to the corporate state when they're outside, but inside they generate $50,000 or $60,000 a year, and that is the insidiousness of this system. It's a bit like the war industry. We perpetuate war. Not for national security. We can talk about the Ukraine as another example. It's because Raytheon and Halliburton, and that's how they make their money. And the prison and industrial complex is the same.
Back to the young man that you spoke of at the beginning. I'm assuming no one mentioned that if we had Medicare for all in this country, he would not have had to steal. In order to, that wasn't brought up in the courtroom.
He didn't even steal. He just sold drugs.
He sold drugs, whatever.
Oh, you mean originally? Yeah. Well, he was in a robbery. It was
no. I mean, when he sold drugs to get the oxygen for his child, that should be just dismissed. Just
of course. What would you do? Watch your kid die?
What? Yeah, and then you could be thrown in jail for murder. They'll take you for anything these days, apparently. Yeah. Chris, the book is Our Class, Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison. And you took these people, these inmates wrote these stories. And as you said, it was transformational. I wasn't going to go here, but we did start with talking about the role of labor in helping us with the class war. Could you talk a bit about the role of art?
Well, there is an incredibly important role for education and art within any labor movement. When you read the history of labor movements, education is a key component in terms of teaching workers about the configurations of power, which is what I spend a lot of time doing in prison. Art becomes an expression. I mean, I knew Pete Seeger before he died. These activities are incredibly nurturing for all resistance movements, including labor movements. If you read Emma Goldman's autobiography, and they're all on the Lower East Side working, 10, 12 hours a day in sweatshops. At night, they're all going to Yiddish anarchist book club groups. And so education and art are absolutely key in terms of not just self-expression, but self-understanding and understanding of the forces around you. The first New Deal project that the right wing destroyed was the Federal Theater Project, because they were doing plays like The Cradle Will Rock, which is this savage takedown of the capitalist class. In fact, they shut the theater down before it could even be shown. This was Houseman and Orson Welles. Orson Welles doing a Black Macbeth in Harlem, which young James Baldwin is taken to by his teacher, who was white, and utterly transformed Baldwin. So yes, the power of art and the power of education are key, and that's nowhere more important than in the prison system, where we have denied, and these are incredibly gifted. I mean, they're organic intellectuals. My students have turned their cells into libraries, and think about that, because they're earning $28 a month when they work in a prison, and being fleeced by the commissary and everybody else. So, I mean, a book is a very, very expensive and precious possession. And they're there. And in fact, they when I have a discussion in a prison classroom, it begins at a much higher level than at these elite universities like Princeton, where I've also taught, because these people understand viscerally, because they are a victim of it, white supremacy, institutional racism, how the police and the prison system within D&D industrialization are the primary forms of social control. They get it all. So you begin from a plateau that these elite kids can't even begin to reach, in part because, of course, they're being groomed to be part of the 1%.
Again, the book is titled Our Class, Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison. I encourage everyone to go get it. Giancarlo, let's put the book cover up so you know you're getting the right one when you go and get it. It is sold wherever fine books are sold, but I would get it at somewhere not Amazon if I'm making a suggestion. So turning now to Chris, you were, just so our audience can know, a war correspondent in Central America. You worked for you were working for the New York Times and had a 15-year tenure there, reporting from more than 50 countries. You were the Middle East bureau chief and Balkan bureau chief during the wars in the former Yugoslavia. So we look forward to hearing your thoughts about the tensions, as they call them on mainstream media, tensions simmering on the Ukraine-Russia border. Can you tell the people what they should really be knowing about what we're seeing here?
Well, it is again a ploy by defense contractors. Remember, we after the unification of Germany, Reagan made a promise to Gorbachev that NATO would not be expanded beyond Germany's borders. But Eastern Europe was just too tempting a market for the arms manufacturers, because in order to join NATO, they have to make their weapons systems compatible with NATO weapon systems. And again, billions and billions of dollars. I was in Poland a couple of years ago, and there are just billboards all over the place from Raytheon, which is making a fortune. So, the foreign policy and military establishment, if we look at it over the last few decades, it just leapt from disaster to disaster to disaster. The whole debacle in the Middle East, the war on terror itself, and NATO has not, because the Ukraine is literally on Russia's border. Russia has made it very clear that they, and we, how would we feel, if Russia was stationing troops and weapon systems on the Canadian or the Mexican border? It would be no difference. So, Obama, this is an Obama quote. the fact is, this is Barack Obama, not my favorite person, but the fact is that Ukraine, which is a non-NATO country, is going to be vulnerable to military domination by Russia no matter what we do. This is an example of where we have to be very clear about what our core interests are and what are we willing to go to war for. That's Barack Obama. But of course, the war industry, which is already complained about losing money with the withdrawal of Afghanistan and the downsizing in Iraq, are stoking conflicts either with Russia or with China, because that's how they make their money. And that's really what this is about. I mean, we have this massive defense budget, which Biden approved, $751 billion, I think. I watched as a foreign correspondent as embassies overseas were in essence militarized. That's the marginalization of diplomats within the State Department. I mean, most ambassadors had no idea what the CIA station chief was even up to within their own country. And then the echo chamber on the media, which essentially repeats the talking points of the war industry. Many of them, of course, MSNBC, CNN, they all pull these figures, Brennan and others, who come out of the intelligence and the military industry. So it's that, it used to be that Dorothy Parker talked about that Katharine Hepburn's emotional range as an actor went from A to B. Well, that's kind of like, the debate that we get. It's A or B. I mean, do we bomb them or do we bomb them and put boots on the ground? There's no actually coherent discussion of foreign policy. And then we get back to the collapse of foreign reporting itself. There are very few foreign bureaus. The profession that I spent my life doing, it's gone the way of blacksmiths.
Yes. Well, we can't have the actual tragedies of war being splashed across MSNBC, or people might, pull their support for unnecessary wars. You can't have that.
I just want to throw in on the Ukraine. If the Ukraine was a NATO country, then the Crimea, which has Russia's major port, a naval port, would become a NATO naval port. I mean, what country in the world would possibly allow that? And of course, they've annexed the Crimea, but that issue is kind of almost never discussed.
So even though there's so much reporting and people are very frightened about Russia and war and nuclear war and escalating into World War III, even though you're saying that this is really about arms sales and profiteering, what will arms sales and profiteering look like for the people of that area and the people of the world who would prefer peace?
Well, it looks like what's happened in Yemen. It looks like what happened in Afghanistan. I mean, the human cost, it's hundreds of thousands of lives. Maybe not hundreds of thousands of lives in the Ukraine, but it's certainly death and destruction and suffering on a vast scale. I mean, that's what the war industry, that's how the war industry works.
It doesn't seem like it would just stick in the Ukraine border if the U.S. had a proxy war with Russia.
The troops that they've moved to neighboring states are in such small quantities that they would be virtually powerless against. I mean, they're trying to stoke this thing that Russia wants to invade Romania, which is ridiculous. I mean, what we don't want to do is go to war with Russia over the Ukraine. I mean, this would just be suicidal folly. But war is a business. I mean, it always has been.
So we're going to funnel arms over there somehow, is what you're saying, so that we can sell.
I think that we already are. I think we already are beginning to approve arms shipments to the Ukraine. But it is all about, people forget why the United States went into World War I. They went into World War I. There was no support for the war. It's why Woodrow Wilson had to pass the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act and throw the socialists like Eugene Debs in jail. There wasn't any support for the war. And Wilson had actually campaigned on the slogan in 1916, he kept us out of the war. But the French and the British, especially with the Russian Revolution, were losing. And the New York bankers, Wall Street was panicky because they had given tremendous loans to the French and the British that they want repaid. And that was the major impetus in terms of pushing. Yes, the Kaiser helped it by sinking some American shipping, but that was the major impetus that pushed us into the war. It's always been about profit, and war has always, to a select number of predators within the society, proved tremendously lucrative. That is what perpetuated the wars in the Middle East. I spent 7 years in the Middle East. It made no sense what we did to attack Iraq. It was, and then to perpetuate these wars for 20 years. I mean, the war in Afghanistan, everybody knew we were losing. The Washington Post published the Afghan papers. There was no debate inside the circles of power that it was absolutely futile. But the war kept continuing because companies like Boeing and Raytheon and were making a killing.
Final question for you on this war. People seem to think, and actually it's being played up in the media as just the tinderbox for World War III. What are your thoughts in that area? Is that just some more fear mongering, or what?
I don't think it's World War III, but I don't think you ever intentionally want to go to war with a nuclear power lightly. I mean, the thing that wars will do is that they have a kind of centrifugal force that you can't control. Once you open that Pandora's box, go back and read the start of World War I, where all of the monarchies kind of marched giddily into suicidal slaughter, completely unaware of where they were headed. So you don't want to trigger an event like that because you can't control it. And I speak as somebody who spent a long time in war. It has a kind of life of its own, or a demonic force of its own, that once unleashed is beyond the control of both the proponents of war and those who are being attacked. So you just don't want to go there, especially over something like the Ukraine.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for being on the program with us today. Chris Hedges, the new book is Our Class: Trauma and Transformation in an American Prison. You can also read Chris's writing at Sheer Post. The piece I talked about earlier today is over at Common Dreams. And of course, Chris Hedges' show on Contact can be seen on RT America, right on your cable dial or on your internets. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
You're watching ACT TV. That's it for today. We will be back next week covering all things activism and all things important to your lives. As you heard Chris say, the algorithm is sometimes unfriendly to shows such as this. So we do appreciate if you share and comment and help us out. We're not asking for cash. We're asking for shares. Thanks again. I'm Julianna Forlano. You can follow me on Twitter, follow ACT TV across platforms, and we'll see you next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Thanks again.